Heat waves, drought, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, blizzards, bitter cold. Extreme weather has an incredible impact on people across the globe. On Mount Washington, our scientists brave some of the worst weather on the planet to improve our understanding of our warming world. Hello and good evening, everyone. Welcome to Mount Washington Observatory Science in the Mountains lecture series. My name is Brian Fitzgerald, and I'm the Director of Education here for Mount Washington Observatory. So glad that you can join us tonight. And to give us a better sense of emergency management is in the state of New Hampshire here is the Chief of Mitigation Recovery for New Hampshire's Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. It's Vanesa Urango. Thanks so much for joining us tonight for the program. For those of you who aren't already familiar, the Observatory is a nonprofit, member-supported organization whose mission is to advance the understanding of Earth's weather and climate. And the way that we do that is through operating our summit-based weather station, our mountain mesonet system here, by doing around-the-clock weather observation and forecasting, by conducting research and product testing projects, and through developing and offering innovative educational programs. If you have questions for tonight's speaker and you're joining us on Zoom, please make use of that Q&A button that you can find right at the bottom of your toolbar there. Feel free to submit your questions at any time during the program, but we'll make sure to leave some time at the end to get those in. If you're joining us on the live stream on Facebook, welcome. Thanks for joining that way as well. We won't be able to join and answer those questions live during the program, but we'll make sure to follow up afterward to get you some responses as well. If you'd like to connect next time through Zoom, feel free to register for the program over at mountwashington.org/SITM. Alrighty, well, before we get things going here with tonight's speaker, we will launch a poll that actually Vanessa helps me with tonight in getting some questions together. First and foremost, we're curious, as always, where you're joining from tonight. And if you're on Zoom, feel free to go ahead and answer as you see fit to these questions. Where are you joining from this evening? Is it a state within New England? Are you outside New England? Perhaps you're outside the country. Certainly curious where you're joining from tonight. Suspect there'll be quite a few folks from New Hampshire. Curious, what brought you to the presentation today? Was it wanting to learn more about New Hampshire's Homeland Security and Emergency Management and what they do? Is it because you're curious about a recent natural disaster in New Hampshire that the state and local governments respond to and how they recover from them? Perhaps you're just interested in natural disasters and you want to know more about how to prepare for the next one, or is it all the above? Next, do you feel like you know what to do and have the things you need to be ready for an emergency, including a natural disaster? Yes, somewhat, or what's a go bag? All right, some responses there. And then finally, how many FEMA declared disasters do you believe that New Hampshire is currently recovering from? None, we're all caught up. 2, 5, or 7? Good question there. I do not know the answer to that one, but I know our speaker Vanessa is going to cover that in just a little bit here. So I'll give you just a few more seconds. I can see quite a few of you have already participated. I appreciate that. And we'll end the poll here in 3, 2, 1. All righty, let's share some results with everyone tonight. Hey, look at that. What do you know? New Hampshire, well represented. The Granite Staters out there making up almost 40% of the participants tonight, but we have representation from all states throughout New England, outside the region, and even a participant from outside the country. Wonderful. Well, thanks for joining. I know even if you don't live in New Hampshire, I'm sure there'll be some great takeaways from tonight's program. Curious about what brought you to the presentation today? Well, the majority of you said all the above. You want to learn all you can about being prepared for natural disasters, but also more about what the New Hampshire Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency does. Do you feel like you know that you have all the things you need to be ready for an emergency and everything you need to know? Well, most of you said somewhat. There's 20% of you who said, yes, you are feeling well prepared. And then some of you said, well, maybe not feeling so confident there. And then finally, the trickiest question here, probably, how many FEMA declared disasters do you believe New Hampshire is currently recovering from? Over half of you said 2. All right, we will see. I do not know the answers here, but that makes for a great excuse. I'll stop sharing here to bring on tonight's speaker. Well, I'd like to welcome tonight Vanesa Urango from New Hampshire's Homeland Security Emergency Management Division here. Vanesa, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for joining us tonight. And thank you for the great questions this evening. I'm curious to learn a little bit more myself, and I'm sure our audiences too. So with that, feel free to take it away.
All righty. Awesome. All right. Let me just start sharing my screen here. All right. Just a quick test. Brian, can you see my screen okay? And can you hear me okay?
Yeah, looks and sounds great. Go for it.
All right. Thanks. All right. So everybody, like Brian said, my name is Vanesa Urango, and I'm the Chief of Mitigation and Recovery here at New Hampshire Homeland Security and Emergency Management. Just a little background on me. I actually studied meteorology at Plymouth State University. So I did my undergraduate and graduate work in meteorology there. So I'm a weather nerd at heart, but I got my start in emergency management when I began as an intern at this agency, which we call HSEM, back in 2015. And I've just kind of been working my way through the agency ever since then. Very fortunate to be in my role now, where as the Chief of Mitigation and Recovery, I oversee the implementation of FEMA's public assistance, individual assistance, and hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. So it was a good opportunity tonight to kind of get a sense of what you all are here to learn a little bit about. So just to recap on our questions. I was very curious to see the answers to number 3 in particular, how many FEMA declared disasters that you all believe New Hampshire is currently recovering from. I will reveal the answer as we go along tonight, but it's really nice to see why you all are here, and I'm hopeful that our conversation will give you a little bit more information about what you need to be prepared for a natural disaster, and a little bit more insight to what we do at our agency and how state and local resources are used to respond to incidents and also recover from disasters as well. So for tonight's conversation, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about who we are. So what is New Hampshire HSEM and what do we do? What are the most common types of natural disasters in New Hampshire? And what are the active declared disasters that we are currently dealing with in New Hampshire? So there's a hint, if you guessed that we have no active disasters, we actually do have some in New Hampshire currently. And what can you do to be prepared for weather-related emergencies? So for us at HSEM, we are part of the New Hampshire Department of Safety. We are one of 7 divisions within this department. Our department also covers the Fire Marshal's Office, State Police, the Department of Motor Vehicles, Fire Standards and Training, and Emergency Services, which includes our 911 call centers. And then we have a division of administration as well that kind of keeps this all put together. So we're a very diverse agency. But for New Hampshire emergency management in particular, our vision here is an informed, prepared, and ready New Hampshire. And we achieve that by following our mission, which is to partner with every community to prevent, mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from all hazards that impact New Hampshire. So through our scope at HSEM, we lead and support New Hampshire and its residents in the preparation for, prevention of, response to, recovery from, and mitigation against all emergencies and disasters. And we do this by operating and managing our State Emergency Operations Center, or SEOC, during an emergency event. And we'll chat more about what our SEOC is and what we do there as well tonight. So first off, I just want to chat briefly about the phases of emergency management. So we're constantly in one of these phases within the cycle of emergency management. And this cycle includes prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. This cycle is often broken up by an incident. And so when an incident occurs, that pushes us into a response mode or response posture. During response, sometimes our State Emergency Operations Center will be activated, and our response often bleeds over into our recovery actions. So we're looking at ways to recover while the response is ongoing. Additionally, during our recovery action, we're looking at ways to mitigate future disasters within the state. And a lot of our mitigation efforts are actually geared towards improving our infrastructure within the state to prevent damages in the future. And then further, we're looking at prevention and preparedness measures all the time. So we're constantly training, exercising, and making sure that our plans stay up to date in the state so that way we're prepared for the next incident response. So a little peek behind the curtain about our agency and our structure. So this is kind of the basic framework of how our division works at New Hampshire HSEM. We have our administration, which is made of our director, assistant director, and deputy director. They help oversee what's called the New Hampshire Information and Analysis Center, or the IAC. So this is the Homeland Security arm of our agency. They're home to the New Hampshire Fusion Center, and they have a nexus to federal agencies like the FBI and the CIA, and they do a lot of counterterrorism and intelligence work over there. So kind of outside of the scope of our conversation tonight, but it's an important part of our division. Now, the remainder of this kind of chart in green actually shows our 6 sections within HSEM. They include our community liaisons and radiological preparedness section, which houses our radiological emergency preparedness, or REP program, and our radiological instrumentation maintenance and calibration shop. We also have our preparedness and response section, which houses our training and exercise unit, the mitigation and recovery team, which is mine. We do the FEMA public assistance and individual assistance grant programs, and FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance grant programs. Our business and finance team, which also oversees our emergency management preparedness grant, or EMPG grant. So if you happen to work at the local level for any state, you might have heard of some of these grants in the past. And our community and school readiness section. So they house our community outreach office and our school readiness program. We're going to talk briefly about just a couple of these sections and how they're involved with the response to and recovery from natural disasters within the state. So our community liaisons and radiological preparedness team, they are responsible for providing technical and organizational assistance to our partners in the field. Primarily, these are municipalities and state agencies that they're supporting. They assist all of our communities and state agencies with planning efforts. They help organize training and exercises across the entire state. They also help facilitate grant work and get them connected to resources from our other teams. And they're also responsible for the radiological emergency preparedness work. So this is specific to Seabrook Nuclear Power Plant, which is a nuclear power station located on the seacoast of New Hampshire. So again, a little bit outside of the scope for tonight's conversation, but it's an important part of what they do and what our agency does as well in the overall preparedness of the state. So our preparedness and response section is the one that is charged with all of our training and exercises across the state that our agency hosts. They also do situational awareness and make sure that communication lines stay open between us and municipalities and state agencies. And they run our duty officer program. So actually, as a heads up, I'm the duty officer on call for this week. So tonight and during our off hours, there is always one of the section chiefs that are on call for municipalities in case they need to get in touch with us for state resources or because an event is ongoing. So fingers crossed my phone doesn't ring tonight while we're together for this hour. But if it does, then you know why. Our P&R, or preparedness and response section, is also responsible for the readiness state of our state emergency operations center. And they also manage the Web EOC platform. So this is a web-based communication tool that is used by our municipalities and state agencies and allows us to do information sharing from anywhere in the state and keeps us connected during events. They also do plan development and maintenance. This includes our state emergency operations plan, continuity of operations plans, continuity of government plans, and state hazard mitigation plans, just to name a few. So they're very busy. And they also serve as a liaison to the Weather Service. So we're very inherently connected to the National Weather Service in Gray, Maine, and we constantly just stay in communication with them in order to be up to date on any weather events that might impact us or our partners or the citizens within the state. And lastly, they manage the New Hampshire Alerts program. So we're going to chat briefly about New Hampshire Alerts at the end when we touch on individual preparedness. All right, the mitigation and recovery section, which, as I said, is my team, we oversee FEMA's grant programs. And so for public assistance, this is the team that is really focused on the recovery post-disaster. We currently have 3 lanes, and those include legacy disasters, which are pre-COVID, the COVID lane, which is just the COVID disaster, and new disaster, so anything that was declared post-COVID. Additionally, FEMA's hazard mitigation assistance grant programs are numerous. These include the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, or HMGP, the Pre-Disaster Mitigation, or PDM program, the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, the Flood Mitigation Assistance, or FMA grant program, and the High Hazard Potential Dam, or HHPD program. So the goal of these mitigation assistance grant programs, like I said earlier, is to help make our infrastructure more resilient. And a great example of this is actually in the pictures on the screen. So we have a before and after shot of a culvert. The before shot shows a set of twin concrete culverts. These are not preferred because they typically are undersized and they're not good for aquatic organism passage. In this case, these culverts were undersized to handle a 100-year flow event, which is kind of the standard that we like to see for culverts nowadays. So they were able to take mitigation assistance grant funding from FEMA and upgrade that to a box culvert, which is more aquatic organism passage friendly and could pass a higher flow event, therefore reducing the likelihood that that would fail in a future event. Another example, and this one is of the public assistance program, is the Loon Bridge. So this is the Loon Mountain Bridge that accesses the Loon Mountain ski area. That bridge failed in the flow event during the Irene tropical cyclone. And FEMA public assistance funding was used to build an entirely new bridge immediately next to that one. So we were able to put in a more resilient structure that will hopefully stand up to a high flow event like the one we saw in Irene, which is record setting in many areas of the state. All right, and lastly, our community outreach office. So these are the folks that are responsible for making sure that our individuals within the communities of New Hampshire and visitors to New Hampshire know what they need to have and what they need to do to stay safe in emergencies. They're in charge of making sure that our readynh.gov website stays up to date. They also host a lot of information about the S4 campaign, which is the See Something, Say Something campaign. This is national, so if you've been to an airport anytime in the recent past, or you watch television, you've probably seen this campaign. And they manage all of our social media platforms, so you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as well. And lastly, they do Ready the Prepared Puppy, which is our preparedness mascot. And Ready goes around to schools across New Hampshire to teach school-age children about preparedness for both themselves and their families. And I wanted to touch briefly on the relationships that we have. So all of our sections work with all of these agencies and more. So we really do have a wide base of relationships and agencies that we work for. So it's not just locals and state government entities. We work with federal entities as well, private nonprofits and private industry as well. So lots of work going on within our agency at any one given time. All right, so I want to shift gears a little bit to natural disaster response. So how does this work in the state of New Hampshire, and what does it look like? So for us, all disasters start and end locally. When an incident occurs, what we typically see is a community will implement its local emergency operations plan. This might also lead them to open their emergency operations center or local EOC. If the need arises and we see a lot of local EOCs opening or start getting phone calls from local emergency management directors, for example, we may activate our state emergency operations center in order to respond to the needs of the community and help coordinate information sharing. Now, what we like to see is our locals reach out to each other for assistance through mutual aid agreements or compacts. So mutual aid agreements are in place to allow local resources to be shared across communities during a response event where they try to manage the incident locally for as long as possible. Now, if the need at the local level is outstrips their resources, then they can come to the state for additional resources. So that might be anything from personnel to coordinating a response through a state agency, to fulfilling, sandbag requests, you name it. We've fielded lots of requests in the past. And then if the state is not able to meet that need at the local level on our own, then we will be the conduit to get federal resources in play. So that can include something as extreme as getting the National Guard involved, to requesting direct assistance through FEMA, or helping by putting a request out to what's called the EMAC or IEMAC system. So EMAC is the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. And it's basically like a posting board for states to put a need out to other states nationally and say, for example, we're looking for a swiftwater rescue team, and we need a team of this many people with this capability. An example of this in New Hampshire is we saw a posting that was put out by the state of Florida post-hurricane, and they were looking for a swiftwater rescue team. So we essentially, as the state of New Hampshire, said, yep, we have a swiftwater rescue team available. Our team is comprised of this many people and this many pieces of equipment. It will cost this much to send them down for X number of days. And other states also put out their own bids, and the state of Florida can decide which resource or resources they want to pull. And then Florida is responsible financially for paying the state of New Hampshire for that service. So we have had swiftwater rescue teams, for example, that have been deployed into post-tropical cyclone environments to assist with pulling people out of floodwaters. So it's a rewarding experience for everyone involved, and it gives our teams the chance to experience flooding events in other states too. So that's just one example of an EMAC request in action. And then an IEMAC is the same idea, but it's international. So one example of this is that we have a really good working relationship with our Canadian partners, and we can send requests up to them when we're unable to fulfill them domestically. And then lastly, a note on recovery. This process begins, like I said earlier, before the incident is even over. So while the State Emergency Operations Center is staffed, my team is there as well, taking a look at the damage and deciding whether or not we think FEMA will need to be involved for a long-term recovery effort, and whether or not a disaster declaration will need to be made. So the State Emergency Operations Center, or SEOC, this is a snapshot of our actual SEOC located in New Hampshire. In this facility, you'll notice that there's a lot of desk spaces, and they are all specific to ESF, or Emergency Support Function, which we'll talk about in a moment. This gives a place for people to physically get together and do information sharing, coordinate resources, etc. So really the purpose of this is to be a hub of information sharing and to coordinate a response. We can also help facilitate a federal response in this location as well. And sometimes we bring our federal partners into the EOC, and they will sit with us throughout the duration of the event. We provide situational awareness to all of the parties involved. And we also provide resources for local EOCs and other state agencies, as I stated before. Our SEOC is a self-sustainable building, so it is secure access. It also has a generator and water supply and MREs and dormitory facilities on campus. So we are prepared and ready at a moment's notice to deploy staff down to that facility and potentially work 24/7 shifts for an undetermined amount of time. All right, so what are the SEOC activation levels? They come in 4 flavors, I guess you could say. So on a day-to-day, we are in what's called a steady state, meaning we're in routine operations and the state EOC is not staffed. Now, if there's an incident or event that requires a little bit of increased monitoring or some light coordination, then we might move into what's called an enhanced monitoring posture. And we might have a few ESFs or emergency support functions that are activated at that time. Now, for the partial and full activations, these are when things are really starting to get serious for us. So a partial activation can be for an unplanned or planned event. An example of a planned event would be the NASCAR event that occurs in the summer at the New Hampshire Motor Speedway. We do activate for that just because of the large influx of people coming into the state. In a partial activation, this is an incident or event that requires coordination between our emergency support functions. And there might be a small number of them. Basically, not all of the ESFs are engaged, but a good portion of them. And then a full activation is an incident of such magnitude that it requires an extensive response and recovery efforts to a major life-threatening or property-damaging event. In this case, we typically see the majority, if not all, of our emergency support functions are engaged in the process, and we're looking at a potential long-term recovery. So our emergency support functions, this is specific to New Hampshire, but you will likely find that for the majority of states, these look pretty similar. So what we see here on this chart are the 18 ESFs for the state of New Hampshire and their lead agencies. I won't go through all of these because they're numerous, but just to run you through a quick scenario, what we might see for an ESF activation would be, for example, a winter weather event, a severe winter weather event. We might see the following ESFs be activated for a partial activation, like ESFs 1 and 3. which are Transportation and Public Works. Those are our DOT partners, so they're monitoring roads and giving us updates on DOT assets. We would include ESF 5, which is us, HSEM. We're coordinating the response. We're opening the EOC. We might see ESF 6 and 8, which are Mass Care, Housing, Health, and Medical. That's headed up by Department of Health and Human Services. So they might help us by coordinating warming shelters, by engaging the American Red Cross, for example, if a tree falls on a home and the people cannot stay there, for example. These are the partners that would help us move those individuals or that family into a safe space for however long they needed to be there. We would probably engage ESF 12, which is energy, because we typically deal with power outages in winter weather events. And we might engage ESF 15, which is public information. That's also headed up by our agency. And they're responsible for doing press releases from the governor's office, public information sharing, and rumor control. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of an example of what we might see for a typical partial activation at the state level. But we have a lot of capability within these ESFs. And these are just the lead agencies. They also have support agencies underneath them too that we can dig into for depth when we need a very large, wide scale response. All right, so what are the hazards that have been identified for the state of New Hampshire in our state hazard mitigation plan? Our hazards in the state of New Hampshire are broken up into 3 categories. These include natural, technological, and human caused. Now I'm going to pause for a second to give everybody the opportunity to think about the following question. What is New Hampshire's most common natural hazard? Now, while you're pondering that, I'm going to give you all a cheat sheet. The following are all of the natural hazards that have been identified for the state of New Hampshire in our state hazard mitigation plan. So we've captured everything that we think could happen in the state of New Hampshire on this list. Everything from avalanches to high wind events, which include things like tornadoes and severe thunderstorm damage and derechos, all the way to wildfires, you name it, it's all here. So out of these, we're asking which one do you think is the most common cause for a declared disaster in the state of New Hampshire? All right, now if you guessed inland flooding, then you would be correct. So a lot of people might say, oh, well, what about coastal flooding and why did you split those up? Coastal flooding is definitely a concern in our state, especially because of instances of nor'easters is a big source of coastal flooding. But we find that inland flooding is the #1 cause of damage in the state of New Hampshire. And I'll show you some examples here in a moment. So a question you might be wondering about is what is a presidentially declared disaster and what do you have to have in place in order to have that? So in order to get a presidentially declared disaster, you have to have an event which can be either natural or human caused in nature that exceeds the capabilities of state and local resources. So states can in turn request assistance from the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. And that assistance for post-disaster recovery can come in 2 flavors. We've got the Public Assistance Program, which is for state and local governments and eligible private nonprofits, or individual assistance, which is for individual citizens. So in the state of New Hampshire, we see public assistance declarations much more frequently. In fact, our last individual assistance declaration was with Hurricane Sandy back in 2012, I think it was. So a lot of this has to do with the fact that certain thresholds have to be met in order to qualify for this assistance. And we don't meet the individual assistance threshold for FEMA very frequently, but for public assistance, we do. And we've actually had 18 presidentially declared disasters in New Hampshire in the past 10 years. And that number might surprise some of you, but it's actually pretty a common occurrence here in our state. And actually all of these except one, which was COVID, have all been weather related. So we're looking at natural disasters easily as the primary cause for presidentially declared disasters in the state of New Hampshire. Now, a lot of the damage we see looks like this. So on the left, we have an example of some minor culvert damage, and on the right, some minor-ish to moderate road damage. And sometimes it's a little more intense like this. So we see full-blown culvert blowouts and road damage to more extensive road damage. However, sometimes it looks like this. So this is actually an aerial photograph from a New Hampshire State Police helicopter. And this is a 12-foot diameter culvert that has roughly 30-foot long trees that have been shoved into the inlet side of that culvert. And essentially they formed a dam blocking the water from accessing that culvert. And the water pressure built up so much that it blew the head wall of that culvert out, so a concrete head wall, and then took the entire road with it. And so another shot of that is here. Extensive damage. This culvert was located just near the town hall in the town of Orange. And this culvert was a Department of Transportation asset. So the state went in and made the repairs for this, and then they were reimbursed by FEMA for this because this was part of a declared disaster that occurred back in July of 2019 in Grafton County. So we see a lot of damages. This is yours truly standing in a road washout. So just to give you some context, I'm about 5'7", so there were parts of this washout that were about 6 feet deep or deeper. And this was an access road to Mount Cardigan, and this is a Department of Natural and Cultural Resources asset, this road. So FEMA did also make reimburse the state for the repair of this road as well. And sometimes our damage looks like this. We're watching flooding and events as it's ongoing to try to anticipate what type of response recovery-wise we are going to need with FEMA in play. And sometimes it looks like this. So this is an example of a culvert/bridge failure in the Alstead 2005 flooding event that occurred in New Hampshire. So for those of you that have lived in New Hampshire since then, this is a very memorable flooding event that occurred in the state. All right, so here's the answer to that third poll question. If you guessed 7 active disaster declarations in the state of New Hampshire, then you are correct. So there were 2% of polling participants that got that question right. We do have 7 open disasters currently, and they date as far back as July of 2017. And some people might be surprised to see just how long these disasters stay open. So for example, the July 2017 flooding event had a dam that failed. And so things like dam repairs take a lot longer to do due to environmental concerns and public notice and stuff like that. So for those reasons, certain projects can keep disasters open for a long period of time. But something I want to draw your attention to is the pattern here. So if you look at all of our events that are currently open, you will see that 6 out of the 7 of them have a flooding component. So flooding is the #1 reason for disaster declarations in the state. And of those 6 flooding events, all but 1 were inland flooding. So the DR 4370 March 2018 event was a coastal storm that caused flooding on our seacoast. And that was actually the reason for some of the seawall damage that we have. And so the seawall engineering study and repair is still ongoing at this time. So overall for these flooding events, we've got about $58 million in FEMA claims that are currently in play. It is subject to a cost share. So FEMA's program has a 75-25 split. So it's 75% local, 25% applicant. And I wanted to just note the outlier in all of this, which is the COVID disaster. The COVID disaster is still open. We've got $233 million in FEMA claims and counting. So it really shows you kind of the magnitude of that event versus our standard natural disaster event that we typically see in the public assistance program. And it gives you a sense of just how much it really taxed the resources within the state. So just a quick note on the COVID-19 pandemic, because we can't get away from it, and it is part of this conversation. Our State Emergency Operations Center opened at a partial activation for this event on March 13th of 2020. So that was just when the first cases were being announced in the state. 10 days later, we went to a full activation, and we remained at a full activation in our EOC for 16 months before returning to a steady state. This far outstripped our previous record of 16 days with the SEOC open, and that was due to the 2008 ice storm. So the majority of that response in the state EOC, especially in the beginning, it was a 24/7 operation. And so we're talking about a huge number of state resources and federal resources being committed. So many ESFs in play, and a lot of our team were on 13-hour rotating shifts for a long time. So a lot of work happening behind the scenes to make sure that other state agencies like DHHS could do the work that they needed to do. And additionally, HSEM played a key role in coordinating and facilitating New Hampshire's response to the COVID pandemic. We did a lot of information center work. So we had a joint information center, and we also helped run the 211 and unemployment call centers. We did a lot of personal protective equipment, or PPE, acquisition and distribution. So we're talking about masks, gowns, gloves, et cetera, and getting those out to our public health partners who needed them in the field. We did vaccine distribution. So if you went to a state fixed site to get a vaccine or went to the New Hampshire Motor Speedway mass vaccination clinics that took place, that was us. Something that a lot of people don't know is that we actually had maybe about 7 to 10 days of lead time from the time we got the go ahead to say, okay, do a mass vaccination clinic at the New Hampshire Motor Speedway to the time we actually had to execute it. So just a shout out to some really brilliant people at our agency who are masters with logistics that made that happen. It was really cool to see so many people come together and make that work. And then lastly, FEMA funds disbursement. So like I said, that $233 million gets pushed through a team of 5 people at the state. And that's 5 people on my team that are running the FEMA program for COVID. So lots of work and lots of funding running through that as well. All right, so our last topic for this evening is individual preparedness. So I want to talk briefly about what you can do to make sure that you're prepared for the next emergency in the state or somewhere else. If you're a visitor to New Hampshire, or if you're that one person that's hanging out with us tonight from outside of the United States, these are universal tips that anybody can use. So what is emergency preparedness first and foremost? It's knowing what to do and having the things that you need to stay safe. And how do we do that? We do that by staying informed, having a family emergency plan, making an emergency kit, and getting involved. So how do we do those things? To stay informed, if you're in the state of New Hampshire or visiting New Hampshire, we recommend that you sign up for New Hampshire Alerts. So this is actually a New Hampshire branded code red platform. And what you can do is sign up for specific alerts within your area, and you can even dial up or down the radius in the app, so you can decide how far away from your home or your place of interest you want to receive alerts for. You can also monitor the weather through this app. It does do push notifications, which are really nice. But I always put a plug-in for the weather service, so everybody should be checking out www.weather.gov. I always say not weather.com, just because that's the private side. I'm going to put the plug-in for the government side here. But weather.gov, those are your local forecast offices that run a 24/7 operation, really reliable information. So keeping an eye on the weather is important. As you can see, the majority of the work that we do in my office is due to response to natural disasters. It's due to weather. So we're constantly monitoring the weather, and so should you, to keep yourself informed. Additionally, FEMA does have a notification app. It's free for download, and it provides resources about planning ahead and being prepared for disasters. And it also gives you information about what to do if, for example, an individual assistance declaration does happen to take place in your state. Tells you where to get connected with FEMA for resources, and if you're eligible for financial assistance if that declaration is made. So very helpful app also. And just a quick note about knowing your terms. So sometimes I see a lot of people kind of get tripped up on the difference between a watch and a warning. Knowing the difference is the key to being prepared here. So I like to not make fun of this, but keep it fun. And I have an example here of a taco watch versus a taco warning. So you might have heard the cupcake watch versus the cupcake warning, but I'm a taco lover myself. So a taco watch means we have all of the ingredients to make tacos, so be prepared for tacos. Now, a taco warning means tacos are already made. It's time to eat those tacos, right? So let's flip the script here and put this in terms of, say, a tornado watch or warning, right? A tornado watch means all of the ingredients in the atmosphere are in play, and a tornado could occur. A watch means be prepared for tornadoes. A tornado warning means that a tornado has been spotted. Meteorologists are seeing rotation on radar. There's an indication that a tornado is already occurring or is imminent and will occur. So a warning means take action to protect your life and property. So knowing the difference between a watch and warning is really important in being informed about what you should do with the plan that you have in place. Which brings me to step 2, have a plan. So you need to know who to call, where to go, and what to do. Now, a great place for this information is readynh.gov. We have templates, so you can put together a family emergency plan or create an emergency contact list. And we recommend that you put these together with your family as a whole, or the group of people that you live with, or whatever your situation is, and then share that information with that entire group so everybody is in the know. And you want to ask yourself specific questions when putting this together. What happens if you're not home or you can't get to your home when an emergency occurs? What is your plan if you cannot communicate via phone? Who will take care of your pet? Things like that. So more tips and tricks can be found at readynh.gov, and there's a whole host of information and resources available online as well to make sure that you have a plan that fits a majority of scenarios. All right, step 3 is to make a kit. So we have an emergency kit shopping list here, and it gives you an idea of the things that should be in your kit or go bag. You need supplies for at least 3 days or 72 hours. That means being self-sufficient for 3 days. And we always put a plug in to remember any medications and make sure that you don't forget about your pets when you're doing this planning process. Additionally, because we live in New England, you want to make sure that you ask yourself if you're making changes to your kit for the seasons. What items do you have in your kit that are unique to summer, and what are items that are unique to winter, and making sure that you're cycling those out. And additionally, we always like to put a plug in that when you do your annual change for your smoke detector batteries, that's the time you want to take your kit out, take a look at it, and make sure that you're cycling your food out to make sure that it's staying up to date. We always joke here at our office that if somebody has their emergency kit dinner, it's because they've taken out a lot of their canned goods that were going to expire soon and have had a really funky meal with their friends and family made of, canned beans and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's a fun thing to do too with the family or with friends, but it gives you an opportunity to cycle through that stuff and make sure that it's up to date, because nobody wants to eat expired tuna in the middle of an emergency. All right, and then last step is to get involved. Learn how to help within your community. There are community emergency response teams or CERT teams. There are trainings available like You Are the Help Until Help Arrives. The National Volunteer Organizations Active in Disasters. New Hampshire does have a VOED chapter here that is comprised of a lot of philanthropic organizations, churches, some private industry. So if you're interested, New Hampshire VOED is a great place to start to get involved. We recommend people take first aid or CPR classes when they're available. VolunteerNH.org is another great place to get signed up to assist in your community or other places in the state. And then also we recommend FEMA's Emergency Management Institute to take free online training courses. So they have independent study courses that are available free of charge, and they have quite literally hundreds of them on every topic of emergency management and beyond. So lots of ways that you can get involved yourself as well. All right, so I'm going to leave you all with this picture of Dr. Lightning from the National Weather Service, and we've got Leon the Lion on the right, who is their mascot for Lightning and Thunder, and then Ready the Prepared Puppy, and that is me inside of the suit, because that's one of the more fun parts of my job. And so with that, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Brian, for any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vanessa. Yeah, wow, I'm glad that you get that, as I guess that's part of your other duties of the job right there.
Yeah, right, pretty much.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for that. I know I certainly learned a lot I did not know before that. For everyone who's joining, yeah, please, by all means, as a reminder, if you're joining us on Zoom, you can use the Q&A button that you can find at the bottom of your toolbar there. I already have some questions from folks that have popped in, but feel free to get your questions in as we go along here. As a reminder, if you're joining us on Facebook, we won't be able to get to those questions right away, but we'll see if we can follow up after the fact to make sure you get your response. Yeah, lots of great questions so far. One that actually I might knock out here that ironically enough is not maybe one for you, Vanessa, but I'm sure there are connection points here. A question from Jeff, who is asking about some emergency planning for folks who are hiking, and I'm sure this comes up quite a bit, but Jeff was curious about for folks who are hiking up to the top of Mount Washington, does the observatory have a login and log out when they are beginning and ending a hike? This would be very helpful info for people who hike along. The short answer to that is no, the observatory does not maintain a login book these days. Historically, there was a login book, sort of like a visitor's log. The state park, when the Sherman Adams State Park building is open, does have a visitor's log. But as far as I know, there is not something like that on the summit, and you should be prepared to take care of your own transportation on foot up and down the whole mountain this time of the year, because the Sherman Adams State Park building is closed to the public. There are no facilities available to the public at this time of the year, which during the shoulder seasons when maybe it's nice and warm down below in the valleys, even as it was just a few days ago here. Not the case on the mountain. It is winter season up there, so definitely plan accordingly. And there's all sorts of planning you can do from that perspective, right? But that's in terms of having, I guess, some connection points there to having actually an emergency plan besides. Question here from Jim, Vanessa, that got me curious as well. What interaction do you or your colleagues have with the ham radio community and other folks who operate as part of sort of emergency response?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've had some limited interactions with the ham radio community. And so where I have seen them in play is kind of coordinated through our ESF2 partners, which are our communications ESF. So one example of this is that we do have ham radio operators that we engage for exercises. One example is the Seabrook nuclear power plant. When we exercise that, we frequently do invite ham radio operators to be involved to kind of test out their capabilities and give an opportunity for them to exercise with our team. That being said, when we do exercises and trainings and drills in general, we definitely like to keep in mind the capabilities of ham radio operators. And sometimes we do have discussions regarding what would happen if our normal communication strategies were to go down. So I think that folks in our training and exercise unit within preparedness and response have a little bit more information about how they are utilized. But as far as day-to-day operations, I'm not as sure, but I know that we do like to have them involved with training.
Yeah, certainly. And from the, even the, when I'm looking at weather and storm damage reports and those sorts of things during events, National Weather Service certainly will congregate a lot of that information coming in from ham radio. I mean, from Mesonettes, from New Hampshire DOT, from a variety of sites. So I know certainly ham radio operators play a significant piece of the puzzle in terms of getting information, especially when electricity and other things aren't available. Thank you for that one. And Marvin has already added a response here. Thank you, Marvin, for reminding that Pinkham Notch Visitor Center does have a hiker register for the winter time. I would encourage folks, certainly though, make sure you are telling a friend, a loved one, what your plan is for the day. Leave a note in your car if you needed to around what your plans are for the day, those sorts of things. Certainly don't rely on a hiker register to get you help or those sorts of things. That would be a very, very last case scenario sort of situation. Some other questions here. One from Rena, who asks, curious, does every state have such a tiered emergency support pyramid? I guess to the best of your knowledge, Vanessa, how does, I guess sort of the structure of New Hampshire's emergency response sort of compare with other states?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what we find in the world of emergency management is that we tend to abide by what are called the NIMS and ICS standards. So it's a general framework for how incident response is supposed to occur. Not every state necessarily subscribes to that, but it provides a universal language. And so while I can't speak for every other state in the country, my guess is that you would probably see a very similar system in place as you do in New Hampshire, especially when it comes to the operation of an EOC, which is where we tend to see people subscribe more to the specific incident command system principles.
Okay, yeah, interesting. I mean, certainly it makes sense. I'm sure there's a lot of best practices around that emergency response conferences, all sorts of things. So I'm sure there's a lot of good information sharing in that way. Another great question here from Sandy, who is curious. Sandy asks, can the governor override your decisions or plans on COVID or some other disaster? And I'll add to that even, what does some of that decision making look like? I mean, certainly there's, I'm sure, directives from the top. You go and try and make a plan. Is there a lot of movement back and forth, through that structure?
Yeah, I would say so. I always say everything with COVID, take it with a grain of salt, because it really tested the way that we normally operate. And we had to do a lot of things for the first time, especially with such a wide scale response. So I would say with disasters in particular, there are certain RSAs in place, laws and regulations in place that govern how the state operates and who has authority to do what. And so while I'm not an expert in what authorities, the governor has in particular, everybody has kind of like a lane they have to stay in, and it's no different for the governor. What I can say is that when it comes to the governor's ability to assist in those types of situations, he obviously can issue a state of emergency, which does give some broader flexibility to agencies when it comes to procurement and resources, which helps get assistance to people faster. And that's something we did exercise in COVID. And when it comes to disaster declarations itself, we actually, we write that up in our office, that request. It goes to the governor for signature, and then they send that off to the president for approval. So federally declared disasters have a lot of federal oversight that the governor doesn't have as much control over, if that makes sense. So that might not exactly answer the question, but based on what I understand in my current role, that's probably the best response I can provide.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'm sure there's a lot to that, and certainly for each disaster, and even COVID, as you mentioned, no two are probably alike, though they probably need to follow a similar trajectory. A lot of great comments in here as well. Andrew just says fantastic presentation, thank you. So I want to make sure to share that. Julie was asking, do you have any advice for folks who might want to get into disaster response on the logistics side? Also want to put in a plug for wilderness first aid, Wilfer WEMT training, which I know you made mention of as well, and some of the ways to get involved. But yeah, I guess on the logistics side, are there ways in which specifically people might help?
Yeah, so I would say I'm actually really glad, Julia, that you asked this question. So a lot of times when disasters strike, people are looking for a way to help. And what we do want to avoid is people self-deploying to an incident scene that actually harms the response rather than helps it. So what we really like to see is people just kind of put their hand up and go to volunteernh.org or call 211 and say, hey, I know that this is happening. I'm really looking for a way to help. And then we can funnel you to the resources within the state that help organize people and put them in the place where they need to be based on what their skill set is and what level that they have to desire to help. So depending on what you can do and how much time you want to invest and stuff like that, they can really pair you up for where you're needed. So going through Volunteer New Hampshire is the best way to go. And sometimes specifically in wide scale events, the state might actually put out a call for volunteers too, and then tell them where to sign up in order to help. So keep an ear out for that. But 211 is also a great resource too, to give a phone call and say, hey, how do I get started in this process of assisting with logistics in a disaster scenario in my community or within the state as a whole?
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, so some great resources that you just plugged there. I already have Volunteer New Hampshire open on my other screen here, taking a look at that, and 211 and beyond. That's great. Thank you for the question, Julia, as well. Yeah, a good question here from Clinton, who a self-professed weather geek with a couple weather stations that he runs on the Seacoast. He's asking, apologies, Clinton, I may not read this verbatim, but essentially, trying to suss out the differences between some of the private weather and news statements that might come out of, say, our state agency like WMUR, or looking at the Weather Channel versus National Weather Service out of Gray, Maine, and trying sometimes to read between maybe some of the hype or those sorts of things. Who should we trust? What sources are you and your colleagues trusting the most?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say that for us, we're working in tandem 100% with the government forecasting entities on this one. So we have a really close relationship with the National Weather Service in Gray, Maine. We know the majority of the team on a first name basis. And when we have, especially, potential impacts, hazardous weather that's going to be coming our way, we do briefs with the Weather Service. And we actually often host calls where the Weather Service will get on the call and brief out to municipalities across the state. So they're really our number one source for weather information. And when it comes to, how do we get that out to the communities and preparedness tips out to the communities? We actually take that information directly from the Weather Service and we put it in press releases that go out through our public information officers and through our community outreach office. So we try very much to be in lockstep with what the Weather Service is providing. And that extends through to the National Hurricane Center as well, the Weather Prediction Center. Like we're pulling all from those resources and our conduit comes through the Weather Service in Gray. They're our number one point person or point entity. So I would say that is the resource that we trust the most. And I feel like we do because we have formed such a good working relationship with them over the years. There's a very strong element of trust between our agencies and we're constantly working in collaboration with each other.
Excellent. Yeah, and certainly our relationship here at the observatory is a strong one with the National Weather Service and letting them take the lead. And they are the lead in terms of those watches, warnings, advisories that you had mentioned previously, and following very closely what they have to say. It may seem understated, perhaps compared to some media hype with some storms, but if you follow their language closely and how they talk about events, they are very clear about possible hazards. So I'm glad to hear that. Well, following up on Julia's question, she was asking not only about, on the volunteering side about getting into disaster logistics and things like that, but I mean, she's curious about professionally. How do you get into the space? And maybe even, I know you mentioned briefly a little bit how your own pathway, but maybe you can talk a little bit about how others you've seen, how they end up in supporting emergency management.
Yeah, wow. I've seen, so the people who work in our agency at the state level are super diverse. We have people from all different types of backgrounds because emergency management is really broad. So obviously I'm kind of honed in on the disaster response and recovery and mitigation side of the house, but we also do a ton of work. Our agency is really strongly involved with school preparedness, which has been a huge topic for our nation. All the way to the Seabrook Station, for example, is part of what we do. And I'm kind of blinking out some of the things right now. Our agency just covers a lot of ground. It's actually hard to kind of explain. So if you're trying to break into the field of emergency management professionally, and it's something that interests you, I mean, working at the state level is a great way to start. Our agency, because it is smaller than other state emergency management agencies, you do get an opportunity to be involved with a much broader variety of responses and stuff like that. Whereas maybe potentially larger agencies out in California or Texas, you might be very focused on one area. So that's the advantage of working in a small state. But additionally, there are private entities that do emergency management work, like Haggerty, for example, is one. And then even locally, so you can get involved. Every municipality in the state has an emergency management director. Sometimes these are your fire chiefs or your police chiefs that wear dual hats. Some are paid, some are volunteer. So however you want to get involved, there's definitely a lot of room, especially in the state of New Hampshire, to do that. It just depends on what level you want to be. So without getting too deep into the weeds, I would say that's kind of like one way you could get started if you're looking for professional versus just volunteer.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I know. Big agency and certainly a lot of different ways to get there, including not only just your pathway as well. Some other great questions here. I know we're running a little short on time, but question from Lori. I know you mentioned a little bit about mutual aid and these sorts of things, but Lori's curious about how New Hampshire interacts with our neighbors like Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, asking for help, those sorts of things. How do you see those relationships normally?
Yeah, so we have strong ties with our partners in our neighboring states, and this extends far beyond just working in an emergency situation. So I will say when we activate our SEOC, the very first thing we do is actually call our respective duty officers in our surrounding states and let them know. A lot of times too, when we're looking at natural disaster events, we're New England, our states are small and they're packed really closely together. So it's very rare that just one state is impacted. It's mostly all of us. So we have to coordinate to make sure that we're not stripping resources, from one state into another. Stealing from Peter to pay Paul, or whatever that expression is, right? So we do coordinate a lot. A lot of times we see this with utility workers, for example. We have to make sure that we are spreading them out amongst the states enough after disasters to make sure that everybody kind of gets restoration services equally. So in addition to that, the directors at each of the state emergency management agencies within the New England region, they all talk to each other and have a strong working relationship as well. So there's a lot of coordination that goes on behind the scenes.
Awesome. Yeah, Absolutely. And with so many borders and this small region here, you know, with so many neighboring states, it's only natural that you're going to be bumping into folks and you know, things like weather. Certainly doesn't care much about borders, does it? And lastly, hey, speaking of weather, why not end on one last question here from Gardner, who asks a good weather related question. I know you spoke about watches and warnings, but Gardner's curious about what about hazardous weather outlooks? Where does this designation fit in the previously mentioned designations?
Yeah, so, oh man, I'm wishing that I had like my National Weather Service partner sitting on my shoulder because I know there's a specific definition for this.
Yeah, maybe I can cheat for you a little bit here.
Thank you. I know there's a timeline involved. I can't think of what it is off the top of my head, but while you search, I mean, in general, hazardous weather outlook is as the name suggests, right? We're looking at something on the forecast horizon that, you know, garners our attention, but hasn't yet risen to the level of a watch or warning or hasn't yet entered, you know, the time window of a watch or warning. So do you have it in front of you? Do you want to validate
I mean, well, I'm going to cheat here. This is Wikipedia. It may not be the best source. It's a weather statement issued to provide information of potential severe weather events within the next 7 days. So there you go. There's that time frame. The outlook may include information about potential severe thunderstorms, could be heavy rain or flooding, winter weather, extreme temperatures. So it is kind of that catch-all
right
of potentially hazardous stuff about to happen, and then more specific, you know, watches or warnings for whatever that phenomena may be.
Right. As the forecast gets, as the severe weather approaches and gets closer and that forecast window shrinks up a little bit, we become more certain, and then we can kind of specify what the hazard's going to be and attach an advisory, watch, or warning to it. So,
which may or may not ever come. So yeah, but it's certainly an important one, and yeah, something I'm taking a look at once in a while. You know, you see that pop up. I always have my favorites page is National Weather Service out of Gray, Maine. And so I look at that and say, oh, what's that hazardous weather outlook? Got to take a look. Something's coming. All right. Well, thanks for that question, Gardner. And thank you so much, Vanessa. I really appreciate you giving your time this evening, even though you're technically, well, sort of on duty, at least on call anyways. I'm glad that we made it this hour for all of our sakes, that you didn't get a phone call here. But thank you so much for presenting tonight, and thanks to everyone for joining. Really enjoy these presentations, and certainly where we can share the good work going on at HSEM. Certainly appreciate that opportunity too. If you enjoyed tonight's program, certainly we would strongly encourage you to make a donation to help support programs like these. You can do that over at mountwashington.org and hit the donate button in the upper right-hand corner. Right now, we're in the midst of our year-end fundraising campaign, and certainly we rely heavily on donations at this time to keep our work moving forward for the next 90 years on Mount Washington. Thanks everyone to those of you who've contributed recently, including those who helped us reach our Giving Tuesday goal. That was amazing. Thank you so much. If you have thoughts about tonight's program or suggestions for future program topics, please take some time to fill out the Google Form survey that'll show up in the Zoom window when you leave the program here tonight, and also in the thank you email that comes out to everyone who joined through Zoom. Don't forget to join us for our program next month, which will be Tuesday, January 17th, when Earth scientist Dr. Jiwin Fan from the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory will talk to us about her recent study linking Western wildfires with larger and more severe hail events. So don't forget to register for that program. You can also watch any previous programs you may have missed over at mountwashington.org/SITM. We'll see you all again soon. And thanks again, Vanessa. Really enjoyed it. Have a great night.
Thanks all.
Yeah, take care. Have a good night, everybody. Bye.